Imagine a company with almost no land, no natural resources, and a population smaller than most global cities. No oil, no minerals, no farmland, and yet this company consistently outperforms entire continents. If Singapore were a corporation, it would be the kind investors love. High efficiency, extreme discipline, zero tolerance for waste, and relentless execution. In just one generation, Singapore transformed itself from a fragile trading outpost into one of the most profitable micro-corporations on Earth. Not by luck, not by natural advantage, but by design. Every policy is optimized, every square meter is accounted for, every citizen is treated as human capital. But here's the real question this video asks. Is Singapore the ultimate model of how a country should be run? Or the warning sign of what happens when efficiency becomes the highest value? Because when a country operates like a perfectly engineered company, someone always pays the price. In this episode, we break down Singapore as a business, its founding strategy, its operating model, its hidden costs, and the trade-offs that come with building a nation that leaves nothing to chance. Stay with me. Every company has an origin story. Singapore's began as a forced spin-off, unwanted, under-resourced, and written off by almost everyone. In 1965, Singapore was expelled from Malaysia. No hinterland, no army worth mentioning, no domestic market, and no guarantee of survival. If this were a startup pitch deck, Singapore would have failed a slide one. So the leadership made a radical decision. Singapore would not try to be self-sufficient. It would become indispensable. Instead of competing on size, it competed on reliability. Instead of ideology, it chose execution. And instead of populism, it chose long-term planning, even when it was unpopular. The founding strategy was brutally simple: absolute political stability, zero tolerance for corruption, open doors to global capital, and a workforce engineered for productivity. Think of it as a company choosing to specialize in operations, not invention. Singapore didn't try to be Silicon Valley, it tried to be the world's most trusted platform. Ports were built before factories. Housing was built before consumer demand. Education was aligned directly with economic needs. This was not a democracy optimized for debate. It was an organization optimized for survival. Every policy asked the same question: does this make us competitive? And if the answer was no, it didn't matter how popular it was removed. That founding mindset still defines Singapore today, like a startup that never stopped acting like it could fail tomorrow. Most countries are run like political arenas. Singapore is run like an operating system. If Singapore were a company, its structure would look familiar to anyone who has worked inside a large, disciplined corporation. Clear hierarchy, centralized decision-making, long-term planning, ruthless performance metrics. At the top, the state behaves less like a referee and more like a controlling shareholder. Key sectors, housing, transportation, finance, land, are not left to chance. They are coordinated. Take housing. Over 80% of Singaporeans live in public housing built by the Housing and Development Board. But this isn't welfare housing, it's asset engineering. Citizens don't just live there, they buy into the system. Home ownership ties personal wealth to national stability. People don't just vote with opinions, they vote with equity. Now look at capital. Singapore doesn't nationalize industries the old way. Instead, it owns stakes through the state investment arms like Temasek Holdings. This allows the government to act like a board member, not a bureaucrat. It influences a strategy without killing efficiency. Ports, airports, logistics, finance, each sector is treated as a business unit, measured, benchmarked, optimized, and unlike most governments, Singapore actually shuts down what doesn't work. No sentimentality, no legacy protection, no political theater. The result? Low corruption, high trust, predictable rules. For global investors, Singapore feels less like a country and more like a premium corporate headquarters with a flag. But there is a cost to this model, because when efficiency is everything, human friction becomes a problem to be minimized. And in the next part, we'll look at the workforce, how Singapore engineers human capital, and what happens when people are treated like balance sheet assets. Every high-performing company invests obsessively in its people. Singapore does the same, but at a national scale. From an early age, Singaporeans are placed inside a system designed to optimize outcomes. Education is not just about curiosity, it's about alignment. Schools are tightly linked to labor market needs. Streaming, testing, and tracking start early, identifying who will become engineers, managers, technicians. In corporate terms, this is talent sorting. The system produces a workforce that is highly skilled, extremely disciplined, comfortable with hierarchy, and deeply pragmatic. Efficiency is rewarded, compliance is normalized, risk-taking is carefully controlled. This creates something rare, a population that behaves like a professional workforce. But Singapore's labor strategy doesn't stop with its citizens. As a micro corporation, Singapore constantly supplements its core staff with external contractors. Foreign workers build the infrastructure. Expats manage regional operations. Migrants fill roles locals won't. At any given time, non-citizens make up a significant portion of the workforce, a flexible labor layer that keeps costs competitive and productivity high. It's brilliant, and it's brutal, because when people are treated as inputs, inequality becomes a structural. The pressure to perform is relentless, failure is expensive, burnout is private. Mental health struggles exist, but quietly. Creativity survives, but within boundaries. In Singapore, life feels stable, but the stability is not the same as freedom, and that trade-off becomes even clearer when we examine the company culture at the top. The rules, the enforcement, and the price of control. Every company has rules. Singapore enforces them like a mission-critical protocol. If most countries negotiate with disorder, Singapore eliminates it. Laws are clear, punishments are predictable, and enforcement is consistent. This is not accidental. It's a strategic choice. In corporate terms, Singapore minimizes operational risk. Corruption is punished swiftly. Public behavior is regulated tightly. Even small offenses, littering, vandalism, public disorder, are taken seriously. The result is something rare at the national level: trust. People trust institutions, businesses trust contracts, investors trust enforcement. In many countries, law is flexible depending on who you are. In Singapore, the system works because it applies to everyone. But control has a psychological dimension. Surveillance is visible. Social boundaries are well understood. People internalize the rules. You don't need constant policing. When citizens self-regulate. For businesses, this is ideal. Low uncertainty, low volatility, low noise. For individuals, it's more complicated. Freedom exists, but within defined limits. Dissent exists, but rarely disruptive. Expression exists, but carefully managed. Singapore isn't an authoritarian state in the traditional sense. It's closer to a corporation with a strict HR policy, efficient, orderly, and unforgiving of deviations. This governance model is one of the main reasons Singapore scales trust so effectively. But trust alone doesn't generate profit. To understand how Singapore became rich, we need to look at its revenue engine, the global economy. Every successful company has a clear revenue engine. Singapore's engine is not domestic consumption, it's the world. Singapore doesn't rely on selling to its own citizens. It earns by positioning itself at the center of global flows: trade, finance, data, talent, and capital. Start with logistics. The Port of Singapore, operated by PSA International, is one of the most efficient container hubs on Earth. Ships don't stop here because they want to. They stop because it's faster, cheaper, and more reliable than anywhere else. Time is money. Singapore sells time. Then there's aviation. Changi Airport isn't just infrastructure, it's branding. For airlines, it's a frictionless node. For travelers, it's a promise of competence. For businesses, it signals precision. Now add finance. Singapore positions itself as a neutral, predictable gateway between East and West. Strong regulation, but not hostile. Transparency, but not instability. Money flows where rules are clear. Multinationals park regional headquarters here. Wealth managers route capital through here. Trade contracts are written under Singapore law. In corporate language, Singapore doesn't sell products. It sells platforms. It earns margins by being indispensable. But there's a vulnerability in this model. When your revenue depends on global stability, external shocks hit harder. Pandemics, trade wars, geopolitical fragmentation. A micro-corporation integrated into everything is exposed to everything, which raises the next question. How does Singapore manage risk when it can't diversify geographically? The answer lies in its balance sheet and how it stores power for the future. Every disciplined company prepares for shocks. Singapore treats risk management as a national obsession. With no natural resources to fall back on, Singapore's greatest asset isn't land or labor, it's reserves. Unlike countries that spend first and save later, Singapore reversed the logic. Budget surpluses are normal, debt is tightly controlled, and long-term capital is quietly accumulated. Two institutions anchor this strategy. One is GIC, which manages hundreds of billions in global assets, equities, bonds, real estate. The other is Temasek, which we mentioned earlier, focused on strategic corporate ownership. Together, they function like a corporate treasury. When crises hit, financial crashes, pandemics, global recessions, Singapore doesn't improvise, it deploys reserves. During downturns, stimulus is fast, support is targeted, confidence is preserved. This balance sheet strength gives Singapore something rare: policy independence. It doesn't need emergency loans. It doesn't need to appease short-term political pressure. It can afford to think in decades. But there's a trade-off here too. Reserves don't vote. They don't protest. They don't demand change. Financial strength can quietly justify rigidity. When a system works exceptionally well, the incentive to adapt culturally or politically weakens, which leads to the most uncomfortable question of all: what happens to innovation, creativity, and dissent inside a system that already believes it has the right answer? Every optimized company faces the same dilemma: efficiency versus experimentation. Singapore invests heavily in innovation, research hubs, startup grants, deep tech funding. Institutions like A-Star anchor national R&D, while districts like One North are designed as idea factories. On paper, the ingredients are perfect, but innovation doesn't just need capital, it needs friction, it needs failure, it needs room to be wrong publicly. Singapore's system minimizes waste, and failure, by definition, looks like waste. Startups exist, especially in fintech, logistics, biotech, but many are incremental, not disruptive, optimized solutions to known problems, not reckless bets on the unknown. In corporate terms, Singapore is excellent at execution innovation, scaling, refining, and deploying ideas proven elsewhere. What it struggles with is foundational rebellion. Cultural norms reward correctness over curiosity. Education rewards answers more than questions. Social systems quietly discourage deviation. This doesn't kill creativity, it channels it. For some, that's a fair trade. For others, it feels constraining. Which brings us to the human question beneath the metrics: is a life inside a perfectly run system better than a messy one filled with uncertainty? To answer that, we need to step back and evaluate the full performance of this micro corporation. Not just its profits, but its people. On paper, Singapore is a success story almost without flaws. High income, low crime, world-class infrastructure, long life expectancy. For many citizens, life is safe, predictable, and materially comfortable. And yet, beneath the metrics, there's pressure. In a system optimized for performance, falling behind is not just personal, it's expensive. Careers are competitive from an early age. Housing prices reward stability but punish deviation. Social comparison is constant, even when unspoken. Failure doesn't break the system. It isolates the individual. Mental health struggles exist, but they are managed quietly, privately, efficiently, like internal errors that should not disrupt the broader operation. Singapore offers something rare, a life with very few shocks. But it also offers very little slack. There is limited room to drift, limited room to experiment socially, limited room to be unproductive without consequences. For many people, this is a fair trade. They accept pressure in exchange for order. They accept a structure in exchange for security. Others feel constrained by a system that never truly turns off. In a company, you can resign. In a country, you cannot, at least not easily. Which brings us to the final question. If Singapore is the perfectly engineered micro-corporation, is this a model the world should copy? Or is it a system that only works because it is small, disciplined, and exceptional? If Singapore were a company, it would be one of the most admired and least understood organizations on earth. It proves something powerful, that discipline can outperform size, that long-term planning can beat a short-term politics, that trust, when engineered carefully, compounds like capital. Singapore shows what happens when a nation commits fully to competence. But it also reveals the limits of optimization, because not every country can run like this, and not every society should. Singapore works because it is small, because it is tightly governed, because it accepts trade-offs others would reject. High efficiency demands high conformity. Low corruption requires a strict enforcement. Predictability comes at the cost of spontaneity. This model cannot simply be copied, it must be contextualized. What Singapore offers the world is not a blueprint, but a mirror. It asks every country the same uncomfortable question: what are you willing to trade for stability, order, and prosperity? More freedom, more chaos, more inequality, or more control? There is no perfect answer, only conscious choices. And perhaps that is Singapore's greatest lesson: that a nation, like a company, is ultimately defined not by what it maximizes, but by what it is willing to sacrifice. If this episode changed the way you think about countries, about systems, or about the invisible trade-offs behind success, then this series is for you, because in the next episodes, we'll continue asking the same question about very different nations, different cultures, different values, and different costs. This is If Countries Were Companies, and this was Singapore, the perfectly engineered micro corporation.